Gerry Martin. Much of my research has required some extra funding, and for the first half of my life, that was derived from making applications to research councils and trusts and foundations, particularly the Social Science Research Council, later ESRC. And so until about 1990, I ran projects through these kinds of sources. But always, I suppose, academics, at least certainly I did, were waiting for this letter in the post, as it were, or meeting, where you'd meet someone who was genuinely interested in what you were doing and decided to adopt the position in the way of a Renaissance patron. That is, someone who had the discrimination, interest, enthusiasm for your work, to support it and comment on it and help you with it intellectually and in other ways, but also to give you funding to support it. And I waited and waited, and there were a few people who gave small bits of support. And then in 1990, I think about July 1990, we'd just come back from a lovely first visit to Japan, and a friend of mine, Simon Schaffer, historian, philosophy and science, said, "Alan, I've got a friend who would like to meet you. I've talked about you to him. He's a retired businessman, and he's been supporting some of my work, and he runs something called the Renaissance Trust, and runs within it something called the Achievement Project. And I think you two would get on." So I approached this meeting with some doubt that it would lead anywhere, because my image of businessmen was stereotypical. I thought they were just businessmen, that was it. And how could we get on? Anyway, in walked this fairly elderly, well, he seemed elderly, but he was only 8 years older than me, gentleman with greying hair, in a formal suit, carrying a briefcase. And I immediately thought, oh gosh, yes, just the sort of businessman I didn't want to meet. But he sat down, and the occasion was that I was going to demonstrate to him the Naga video disc, the video disc of images and films which Sarah and others and I had been working on for about over 5 years. And we'd got nearly completed. We hoped to do a museum exhibition and a book, as well as a video disc and so on. But we'd been doing it with tiny little sums of money, and we'd more or less run out. Anyway, it was state of the art. Nowhere else in the world was such an academic video disc being made. So in one of the rooms in social anthropology, I demonstrated this immediate retrieval software video disc, and it was quite impressive. And then at the end, Gerry looked at me and said very seriously, he had a rather soft and slowly speaking voice, and he said, "Alan," and hesitant and modest, would you need any further support on this project to finish it off?" So I was rather amazed, and I said, yes, it would be wonderful. And he said, "Well, how much do you need?" And it's one of those moments you wonder what you can say too much, and it'll be slammed in your face. Anyway, so I said, well, a few thousand would be wonderful. So, to my astonishment, he got out his checkbook, made out a cheque. I think it was for £3,000 or £4,000, and handed it to me. And he said, "If you need any more, just tell Simon, and he'll tell me. So that was the beginning of a wonderful relationship for about 15 years until he tragically died. The next few years mainly consisted of joining one or two of his projects. What he was doing was funding museums of the history of science, because that was his interest in Oxford and Cambridge and elsewhere, helping PhD students of Simon and others, and running conferences on the theme of achievement. As a businessman who had achieved himself, he wanted to try and encourage others to do so. And so it's time to explain something about who he was. Gerry was born in Birmingham, about 1933, son of just humble factory workers or some such, and he left school when he was 16 and went to Canada and became an engineering apprentice in Canada. And then when he was in his late teens, he came back to England and settled in, or married and settled to Hilda, his very sweet wife, and they settled in the south of England near Brighton. And with a partner, he set up a control engineering fund, which was called Eurotherm. And he was always interested in ideas, though he'd left school early, and he had in the back of his mind that if the firm was successful, he might be able to retire early and then pursue his intellectual interests. So he put aside some percentage of the shares in the company, or at least notional shares, because it was a private company, in a fund, the Renaissance Trust. And if it was successful, that would be worth something. So he then spent 30 years in building up this company. And he had a superb strategy, which was very like Japanese management strategies of the time, very egalitarian. The business, when it grew large, he never made it hierarchical at all. The managers and the workers ate together and wore the same things and mingled together. And he spent an enormous amount of time on the selection of the top key people. He explained all this to me, that an organization is all about social relationships. It's all about trust, and it's all about working with people who you really respect. And so when it was expanding, he would put out an advertisement, presumably, and then he would interview the prospective people in depth. That is, he would spend some days with them. They would come down and stay in a hotel near him, and they would spend 3 or 4 days walking, talking, getting to know each other. And on the basis of that, he would decide whether they were the person he wanted to really work with. And once he'd selected someone, he gave them his full backing and support. And he had a system whereby he would put this person in a key position in some other area. The firm expanded all over Eastern Asia and other parts in America and elsewhere, and he would send this person out with a substantial financial package to start up an offshoot company. And it would become more or less independent, though it would send back some of its profits to the main company. So it was a system very like a Japanese household, with the main branch and then setting up sub-branches. And it worked fantastically well. He became the most important, or it became the most important company, producing machinery for temperature controls, for example, for Pilkington Glass, the huge glass company in the north of England. He produced the temperature controls. And so it became more and more successful. And when it floated, finally, in the 1980s, put it on the stock exchange, sold the company, it was worth then some 500 million or more, which is a lot of money in today's prices. And the two people who started it shared the profit. One of them bought a big country estate and house in Sussex. Gerry had a nice house, and he didn't waste it on buying more houses or luxury things. He did what he had intended, which was to start using it to support academic and intellectual research, and also to collect scientific instruments, particularly those made with glass, particularly microscopes. So he had one of the finest collections of microscopes and telescopes in England, certainly. And he supported institutions, as I mentioned, like the various museums and various scholarships and various conferences. So the conferences I went to half a dozen, which were held in Windsor Great Park or elsewhere, or Oxford, on various themes to do with achievement. One was on Japan and England and how they compared. Another was on the European miracle, as it was called. And Gerry also used to come to seminars which I ran in Cambridge, and his friend and advisor Patrick O'Brien ran at the Institute of Historical Research. Now, when he first launched out on his retirement plan, he found that academics, like I'd been, were very suspicious, and he couldn't find anyone who really saw what he was about, except to a certain extent Simon and a lady called Penny Gook, who helped him. So he was somewhat frustrated. But when we met, we just really clicked. I had, by then, worked with lots of small groups and people I admired, and I found it very easy to communicate with him. He was always curious and interested. And what was really good was that our interests were entirely, or at least our backgrounds were entirely different, but we each wanted to learn from the other. It was like going to another civilization and becoming very closely involved with one or two people there and learning at their culture, and they learnt yours. In this case, it was within this country, but the two cultures, as C.P. Snow called them, were miles apart. Science and technology was his field, so he taught me about science and technology and had many fascinating and important theories which I've used, the triangle of creativity and discovery and other ideas, bounded but leaky, all sorts of theoretical ideas which I've used, he'd already developed. And so he taught me about science and technology, but he knew nothing about history really, or anthropology, and was very intrigued by both. He could see that that dimension was very important in understanding creativity and achievement. So I taught him basic anthropology and history. And we formed this very close bond, supported by Sarah and Hilda, whereby we used to go down and spend a weekend with him, or he would come to Cambridge every few months, and we'd be on the phone and have meetings. And when we met, we would go for long walks together, discussing what we were thinking about and doing. And he very carefully and with great attention read everything I produced. It was the time when I was beginning to produce books on, or ideas on Japan, essays on Japan, beginning to encounter great thinkers like Adam Smith and Montesquieu and Tocqueville. And he read all these books, annotated them carefully, encouraged me. He was enormously encouraging. He would, usually not in words, but in letters and other things, say, "Alan, I think what you're doing is immensely important, and I'm very happy that I'm involved with it and happy to support it. And support it he did. He gave me whatever funds I needed, amounting to some considerable amount. So from then on, for the next 15 years, I never needed to apply for grants or money. I had as much as I needed. I could hire some research assistants. I could easily travel, as we did every year, to Nepal, or later start traveling to Japan and China, and buy whatever computers or video cameras I needed. He added to that his own technologies and gave me, one occasion he came and said, "I've got something in the back," and it was a really good photocopying machine. Another time he had something in the back, and it was a huge and beautiful 19th century telescope, which I have over here in the barn, made by one of the best telescope makers. And so he gave me things, and at his death he instructed that I could take any of his books. He'd built up quite a nice little collection of history and anthropology and other subjects, and I selected a few of the books from there. So we had these endless conversations, deep friendship. He was like an older brother. I wasn't deferential, but I deferred to his wisdom and knowledge, because this was the main thing about him. He was a very wise man. He'd thought things through very carefully and patiently, worked out really good solutions to many problems. And so it was not like a teacher that I'd experienced early in my life, a sort of mentor, but it was two-way. And I really enjoyed and looked forward to meeting him. And our friendship was cemented by traveling together. We went first in 1992, we went to Nepal. I suggested going to our village, and he and Hilda went and were thrilled. Hilda was quite ill, but still enjoyed it, and we went up to this mountain village and spent a week there, and it was an experience which Gerry would never have had normally, to go with an anthropologist on their fieldwork. And that was really a bonding, because that was a precious place for Sarah and I. And then in 1996 he suggested going to China. So our first visit to China, and looking at China through his eyes, was a revolution, because as a businessman he could see, he said, "Alan, this is just incredible what's going to happen here, it's just starting." And he saw behind the still fairly antiquated state of China in 1996, and we travelled as tourists, sometimes getting off the beaten track, around China, and that wakened our interest in China. Then in 1997 I was in Tokyo for a term as a visiting professor, and we invited Gerry and Hilda, so we spent a couple of weeks or so travelling around Japan together, which was also wonderful. On other occasions we went down to their Cornish house, a beautiful little secluded house, a couple of times. We went to their Paris flat once. When I was filming the television series The Day the World Took Off, he was present throughout the seminar series, and we went with him to Venice and discussed glass and other things together. So through travel, through conversations, through working on manuscripts together, we fused together. And his influence, I think, of all the people who are not family or students or academic contacts, his influence is by far the greatest, and I would like to pay this huge tribute to Gerry Martin.